Number 3. Maria Honzell. We covered the murder of Maria Honzell in our September 2020 video, 3 Unsolved Babysitter Mysteries, Part 3. On the night of February 7, 1977, 14-year-old Maria Honzell was babysitting for a neighbor, Janie Kusalika, in Kusalika's Colorado Springs, Colorado apartment. Sometime between 8:30 p.m. and 9 p.m., Kusalika called home and spoke to Maria. Kusalika didn't notice anything unusual about Maria. She returned home at around 11:15 p.m. Nothing seemed to be out of place. She then went into the main bedroom and found the dead body of 14-year-old Maria Honzell. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, and she had a horrifying wound on her neck. There were signs she had been sexually assaulted. Kusalika checked on her sons. They were sleeping and unharmed. The police were called. They found no signs of a break-in or forced entry. The police talked to the 2 boys Maria was babysitting. The eldest, who was 8, said that he went to sleep around 8 p.m. But sometime later he was awoken by a commotion in the living room. He went into the room and saw that there was a young man in the apartment. He was older than 14-year-old Maria. The boy thought he was about 17 years old. He was white, 6 feet tall, and had scruffy hair and acne. The young man had his hand over Maria's mouth, and she was screaming at him to stop it. Then they went into the main bedroom. The boy went back into his bedroom. At the time, the police thought that Maria knew her killer because she seemed comfortable enough to let him into the apartment. Maria had a boyfriend, and the police investigated him and his friends, but no arrests were made. The police did develop a suspect who they did not name. He moved away from Colorado Springs shortly after the murder. He later murdered a girl in Rhode Island, but he was never charged with Maria's murder. Decades later, the evidence was examined for DNA. It turned out that the killer had cut himself and left a bloodstain on Maria's jumpsuit. A DNA profile was created, and it was compared to the DNA of some of the persons of interest. No match was found, so they inputted the profile into the FBI's combined DNA index system. Once again, a match was not found. In 2019, a year before our episode went live, the police sent the evidence to Parabon Nanolabs, a private DNA lab. 5 years later, the police were notified that they had found a suspect using genetic genealogy. He was William Bill Charles Kernan Jr. Kernan had been an acquaintance of Janie Kusalika. He had been to her apartment several times. At the time of the murder, Kernan was a 27-year-old college student. He was mentioned in the original investigation, but he was never considered a person of interest. It was too late to charge Kernan with Maria's murder. He had died of natural causes in August 2010 at age 61. The police did not release much information about Kernan, but it does not appear he had a criminal record. The police wanted to get a sample of his DNA to confirm without doubt that he was the killer, but they were unable to. He had been cremated, and the police said he had no biological living relatives. However, they are confident enough to say that after 47 years, the murder of 14-year-old Maria Honzell is officially closed. Number 2. Asenath Dukat. We actually don't cover the murder of Asenath Dukat in one of our criminally listed videos. Instead, we talk about it in the 28th episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. The main focus of the episode is the September 1982 murder of 8-year-old Kelly Prosser. On September 20th, 1982, Kelly was walking home from school alone in Columbus, Ohio. Tragically, she was kidnapped. Her body was found less than 2 days after she was taken. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. Her murder was finally solved 38 years later. If you want to learn more about her murder, you should check out the episode. It's available in podcast form wherever you listen to podcasts. We also have a video of the podcast on this channel. What was disturbing about Kelly's murder was that 8 other girls were murdered in the Columbus area around the same time. One of those girls was Asenath Dukat. 2 years before Kelly's murder, 8-year-old Asenath lived in Upper Arlington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus. On June 3, 1980, Asenath was walking home alone from school. It was a distance of about 12 blocks. Tragically, she never made it home. Around 4:30, her parents reported her missing. 3 hours later, her body was found in a drainage ditch about a block from her home. She had been raped, strangled, and struck in the head with a 20-pound limestone rock. The police believe the person who killed Asenath attacked another girl about a month earlier. On May 7, 1980, an 11-year-old girl and her friend had been walking home from school. The 2 girls broke away from each other close to their respective homes. Shortly afterward, the 11-year-old girl was grabbed from behind by a young man. He choked her into unconsciousness. She survived the attack. The police said that both attacks were sexually motivated. A red 10-speed bicycle was spotted in the area both times. In the May 7th attack, the 2 girls said a young man on a red bike rode by them twice. In Asenath's murder, a witness saw a red bike leaning up against a bush near where she was murdered. The police said they had several persons of interest, but no arrests were made. After Asenath's murder, 8 more young girls, including Kelly Prosser, were murdered over the next 2 years in the Columbus area. By the time our podcast went live in July 2021, 7 of the 9 murders, including Kelly Prosser's murder, have been solved. What we didn't know when we wrote and produced the podcast episode was that in 2006, the police had the evidence from both the May 7th assault on the 11-year-old and Asenath's murder examined for DNA. In November 2007, they got the DNA results for the May 7th assault, and in February 2008, they got the results for the murder of Asenath. The results were a bit surprising. The DNA found at both crime scenes was different. The DNA from the case where the 11-year-old girl was assaulted on May 7th was linked to a man named Robert Winchester, who went by Chris. At the time of the murder, Chris Winchester was 20 years old. The police knew who Winchester was. Between 1973 and 1977, the police were called to his family's home 3 times because of violence in their home. When he was 13, his mother called the police because he had been fighting with his father. His mother said it had happened before and she was worried about her son's safety. Nearly a year later, Winchester and his father got into a fist fight over the color adjustment on the TV. His mother got involved in the fight and a neighbor broke up the fight. The third call was in March 1977 when Winchester was 16. He and his mother argued over the car. He called her a name and she slapped him. He punched her in the head and knocked her out. Then, in May 1980, after the assault and before Asenath's murder, a woman had complained to the police about Winchester. She said a man, later identified as Winchester, rode by her several times on a red 10-speed bike. He stared at her and smiled. Winchester was questioned about Asenath's murder, and he took a polygraph exam 4 days after the murder. The tester believed he was telling the truth. 4 months after Asenath's murder, on September 27, 1980, a man grabbed a 13-year-old girl who was riding her bike. He tried to drag her into a forest. 3 women saw the kidnapping and helped the girl. The man got into his car and drove away. The women saw the license plate and memorized several numbers. They reported the attempted kidnapping to the police and gave them the numbers of the license plate. It led them to Chris Winchester, and he was arrested. Winchester went to trial in January 1981. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. He was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. He served 2, and then he was paroled. He never had another serious run-in with the law. He eventually settled in Columbus, which is where he lives at the time of this recording. When Winchester's DNA was connected to the May 7th assault in November 2007, the police could not charge him because the statute of limitations had run out. In February 1990, there was an interesting wrinkle in the case. A polygraph specialist with the state police reviewed Winchester's polygraph results from when he was questioned about Asenath's murder. It turned out that when Winchester took the polygraph exam, he told the administrator not to ask him questions directly about the murder because he was upset about the murder and he would get emotional. So the administrator only asked him questions about his activities on the day of the murder. For example, quote, "Did you deliberately falsify or admit anything about your activities on Tuesday, June 3rd, unquote. Upon review, the specialist determined that Winchester had not been honest. Then an FBI agent reviewed the results and agreed with the specialist that Winchester had been deceitful in his answers. However, Winchester's DNA was not found on any of the evidence from Asenath's murder. Instead, the DNA of another man named Brett Strutner was found on the evidence. Strutner was 20 years old at the time of the murder. He lived about a mile and a half from the crime scene. Strutner landed on the police's radar after they received an anonymous tip about him. On the evening of the murder, he was acting very bizarrely. He was at a bar and he was visibly upset. He was crying and acting paranoid. He said he couldn't go home because he believed people were after him. Before the DNA testing, it was believed that one man attacked the 11-year-old girl on May 7th and killed Asenath. So the police showed a photo lineup to the 11-year-old girl who was attacked on May 7th and her friend whom she had been walking with before she was assaulted. They both picked Strutner as the man who attacked her. Strutner also had a red 10-speed bike but stopped riding it after the May 7th attack. After Asenath's murder, Strutner left the area. 3 days after the murder, he was in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. He appeared to be stranded in his vehicle. When police officers approached the car, he started stabbing himself in the genitals with a hypodermic needle. He then got into a fight with the police. He was subdued and brought into custody. The police questioned Strutner about Asenath's murder. He agreed to take a polygraph and they took a blood sample. But then, on the advice of his lawyer, Strutner did not take the polygraph. He also stopped cooperating with the police. 4 years after Asenath's murder, in July 1984, at age 24, Brett Strutner took his own life. He was staying at the YMCA in downtown Columbus and he jumped from the 6th floor. For many years, the police believed that Chris Winchester and Brett Strutner were partners in crime. The police called them known associates. Strutner and Winchester had grown up just 6 houses down from each other. The problem is that Winchester's DNA was only found on the evidence for the May 7th assault, and Strutner's DNA was only found on the evidence from Asenath's murder. But another man's DNA was found on a piece of evidence from Asenath's murder. In Asenath's underwear, there was a red piece of cloth. It had a DNA profile that did not belong to Strutner or Winchester. A match to the DNA has never been found. Nevertheless, in August 2022, 42 years after Asenath Dukat's murder, and 14 years after Brent Strutner's DNA was linked to the crime scene, the police announced that they were closing the case. They concluded that Strutner had worked alone. They said they had examined every piece of evidence with modern technology and found no evidence of anyone else being involved in the murder. They did not address the red cloth found in her underwear that had another man's DNA. In 2019, a group of Upper Arlington citizens launched the website, The Long Walk Home, the Asenath Dukat project. They have done an extensive investigation of Asenath's case, which includes newspaper articles and police reports. A lot of the information in this segment came from that website. If you want to read more about Asenath's murder and the investigation, we highly recommend you check out The Long Road. After the police announced the case was closed, they released a statement. It reads, quote, "According to an August 10, 2022 press release, the case of Asenath Dukat may be closed by the city of UA, but it is far from closed for us. We applaud the countless hours and hard work that led to the confirmation of Brent Strutner's involvement in the crime. However, after viewing the totality of evidence, it is reasonable to conclude Brent Strutner did not act alone. Our mission will continue based on that belief, and as long as the Dukat family and our community continue to support our efforts to bring all involved to justice. Explore our site. We are confident you may come to the same conclusion." Unquote. Number 1. Carla Walker. In our June 2019 video, 3 Unsolved Mysteries with Mysterious Letters, Part 5, we cover the murder of 17-year-old Carla Walker. Carla was a popular young woman. She was dating the quarterback of her high school's football team, Rodney McCoy. On the night of February 16, 1974, Carla's high school in Fort Worth, Texas, held a Valentine's Day dance. Carla and Rodney attended the dance together. Just after 1 a.m., Rodney showed up at Carla's home alone. He was bleeding from the head. He told Carla's parents that she had been kidnapped. After the dance, Rodney and Carla went to some local hangouts. Then, they ended up in the parking lot of a nearby bowling alley. Rodney said that they were kissing in the front seats of his car, and Carla was leaning against the passenger door. Suddenly, a large man with a cowboy hat opened the passenger door. The man then started to pull Carla out of the car. Rodney tried to pull Carla back into the car. The man struck Rodney several times in the head with the butt of his gun. During the assault, the magazine from his gun fell to the ground. Once Rodney was incapacitated, the man pulled Carla out of the car and dragged her away. Rodney heard Carla urging him to go get her father. Rodney then lost consciousness. When he came to, Carla and the man were gone. He drove immediately to Carla's home, which was less than a mile away. Carla's parents were awake when he arrived. Carla's father grabbed his gun and raced to the bowling alley. Carla and the man who supposedly kidnapped her were nowhere to be found. While Carla's father went looking for her, her mother called the police. The police arrived at the parking lot shortly afterward. The police found Carla's purse and the dropped magazine in the parking lot, but that was the only trace of her. The police determined it was a magazine from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. 3 days passed, and Carla's friends and family had no idea what happened to her. Then 2 patrolmen found her partially nude body near Benbrook Lake, about 5 miles from the bowling alley. The medical examiner believed that Carla had been kept alive for 2 days. During that time, she was tortured and sexually assaulted. She was also injected with morphine. The killer strangled her to death with his hands. One of the first suspects was Rodney McCoy. He was given a polygraph exam and he passed, so he was cleared as a suspect. One of the strongest suspects in the case was a former Sunday school teacher named Tommy Ray Nealand. He was arrested a few months after Carla's murder in May 1974, for kidnapping a teenage girl from her car. He was later linked to the September 1970 murder of his 27-year-old neighbor, Nancy Mitchell, in her home, and the June 1972 murders of 17-year-old Jane Handy and 15-year-old Robert Golston, whom he picked up while they were hitchhiking. Rodney even picked Nealon out of the police lineup, but Nealon was never charged with Carla's murder. He was sentenced to life for the murders of Jane Handy and Robert Golston and 550 years for the murder of Nancy Mitchell. He ended up only serving 13 years because the Texas prison system was overcrowded. He stayed out of prison for 7 years, and then 2 rifles were found in his truck. This was a violation of his parole, so he was sent back to prison, and he's been incarcerated ever since. Then, in 1978, a man named Jimmy Dean Sasser confessed to Carla's murder, so he was indicted. But then, 8 months later, the charges against him were dropped because he had recanted the confession. He said he was drunk when he confessed. Carla Walker's case was featured in our video about mysterious letters because, in 2019, the police released a letter they had received about the murder. It had been addressed to Oliver Ball, who had been a detective with the Fort Worth Police Department. He accused someone of killing Carla, but the police redacted the name. The person had never been considered a suspect in the case. In the letter, the author wrote, sign 10100 twice. The police think that sign 10100 may be related to the police code for a dead body. The police were hoping that someone would identify the author. If the author was identified, it did not lead to an arrest. The path that led to the case being solved started 3 years before the letter was made public. In the summer of 2016, the podcast, Gone Cold Podcast, Texas True Crime, covered Carla's case. The podcast stirred up a lot of memories and emotions for Carla's friends and family. 2 of her friends approached the producers of a television show, The DNA of Murder, with Paul Holes. Paul Holes was a cold case investigator who was instrumental in solving the Golden State Killer case. The show decided to cover Carla's case. The producers even struck a deal with the Fort Worth Police Department. In exchange for access to case files, they would cover the cost of the DNA testing and genetic genealogy. The police department agreed. In April 2020, the show aired the episode about Carla's murder. Meanwhile, Othram Inc., a private DNA lab, got a minuscule DNA sample from Carla's bra. Then they started the process of genetic genealogy. On July 4, 2020, the police were notified that they had narrowed down a suspect. It was someone the police had interviewed less than 2 months after Carla's murder. The magazine the killer dropped was from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. From the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the police got a list of people who had recently purchased that type of gun in the Fort Worth area. One of those men was 31-year-old truck driver Glenn McCurley. Glenn was a married father and active church member. Glenn told the police that his gun had been stolen out of his truck 6 weeks earlier. He took a polygraph and he passed, so the police did not consider him a person of interest. After Othram Inc. suggested him, the police investigated him. Glenn was considered a troublemaker when he was a teen. At one point, he was placed in a home for troubled boys. When he was 18, he was arrested after stealing a car. He was sentenced to 2 years and served less than a year. But that was it for his criminal record. In February 1963, Glenn married a woman named Judy. Judy eventually gave birth to 2 sons. Glenn drove trucks for a living and built picnic tables on the side. In 1988, tragedy befell the family. Glenn's 24-year-old son, Craig, was struck and killed by a drunk driver. After investigating Glenn, the police went to the home that Glenn shared with his wife, Judy. They had been married for 57 years. Glenn consented to give a DNA sample. It was an exact match to the killer's DNA. On September 24, 2020, 46 years after the murder of Carla Walker, Glenn McCurley was arrested. The police interviewed Glenn and he initially denied ever meeting Carla. Then he told them a bizarre story. He said he was drinking on the night Carla was kidnapped. He was driving around and he ended up in the bowling alley parking lot. He then heard a woman scream. He went to investigate and he believed that Carla was being attacked in the car. He opened the door and got into a tussle with a young man in the car. He brought Carla into his car and then they drove to a different parking lot. Glenn said that she was very thankful and she became affectionate. This led to them having sex. She then got out of the car and that was the last time he saw her. The detectives challenged his story. They pointed out that Carla was a virgin who didn't even have sex with her boyfriend, so they didn't think that she would have sex with a strange man she had just met. Glenn maintained he had not raped her, but he did say that after they had sex, he choked her a bit because he was worried, quote, she'd tell on me or something, unquote. But he maintained he never raped or killed her. 78-year-old Glenn McCurley went to trial in August 2021. The prosecution then presented a surprising piece of evidence. The police had searched Glenn's home and they found the .22 caliber Ruger pistol he claimed had been stolen. After 3 days of trial, Glenn changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison. Glenn McCurley died of natural causes in October 2023 while in prison. He was 80 years old. The police do not think that Carla was the only person Glenn killed. They think he was a serial killer. Nearly 3 years to the date of Carla's murder, on February 18, 1977, 25-year-old June Ward was found murdered in Fort Worth. Her nude body had been dumped next to a curb. Ward was a vocational nurse and she had an 8-year-old son. She and her ex-husband had been divorced for 6 years. The night before her body was found, Ward went out on a date with her boyfriend. It's believed she had car trouble on her way home. She was then picked up or kidnapped by her killer. She had been strangled with her bra, which was still wrapped around her neck. She had also been beaten in the head with something like an axe or a hatchet. On July 9, 1980, nearly 3.5 years after Ward's murder, the body of a young woman was found beside a creek in Fort Worth. She had been dead for less than 24 hours. She had been strangled to death. She was identified as 19-year-old Denise Hogue, who lived a transient lifestyle. Christy Jean Tower was a 26-year-old nightclub waitress at Billy Bob's Texas in Fort Worth. She worked on February 4, 1983, 2.5 years after the last murder, and she was seen walking to her car. The next day, she was reported missing. Her car was still in the parking lot. A newspaper account said that the car had been ransacked. Christy Tower's body was found 2 months later in a field. She had been strangled to death with an electrical wire. Also, her wrists were bound with wire. Just over a year later, on September 29, 1984, 23-year-old Catherine Davis went missing from Fort Worth. She was last seen at her garage apartment. 40 minutes after she was last seen, the garage burned down. The cause of the fire was a cigarette left on a mattress. On June 24, 1984, 4 months after Davis went missing, her remains were found in a field about 6 miles from her home. Because of the state of the remains, the cause of death could not be determined, but was ruled a homicide. A month after Davis went missing, on October 9, 1984, 29-year-old English and social science teacher Marilyn Hartman was found dead in her bedroom. Her wrists had been bound with electrical cord. She had been strangled with 2 neckties. 3 days later, on October 22, 1983, 23-year-old Cindy Heller left a dance class in Fort Worth. She picked up a woman who was stranded after her car broke down. The 2 women had dinner together. The woman asked her for a favor. She wanted Heller to deliver a note to 2 friends living in a nearby apartment. The friends were out and found the note attached to the door of their apartment when they returned home. After pinning the note to the door, Heller went missing. The next day, her car was found in an apartment building parking lot, a short distance from where she left the note on the door. About 2.5 months after Heller went missing, her decomposing body was found in a creek bed. About a month later, on November 26, 1984, a second middle school English teacher was murdered in her home. 32-year-old Catherine Jackson had been gagged, bound, and strangled with a cord. She had been gagged, bound, and strangled with a cord. Her body was found in the bathtub, where scalding water had been pouring onto her body for hours. 20-year-old Angela Ewart went missing on December 10, 1984. Ewart had left her fiancé's apartment that night and had to stop for gas on her way home. Her car was found abandoned the next day. 8.5 years later, in August 1993, her skeletal remains were found in a field south of Fort Worth. The cause of death could not be determined. On December 22, 1984, 21-year-old Regina Grover and 26-year-old David Larson went to a restaurant together in Fort Wayne. The pair had been dating on and off for about a year. The next day, Regina Grover's dead body was found in a creek under a bridge. She had been strangled. Then, while she was alive but unconscious, she was dropped into the water and she drowned. David Larson was found dead in his apartment. He had been beaten to death. The police believe one person killed both Grover and Larson. On December 30th, 1984, 15-year-old high school student Sarah Ann Kashka went missing after spending the evening with friends. Her body was found on New Year's Day, 1985, in a field. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck. Then, just over a year later, on February 24th, 1986, the new dead body of a woman was found in Fort Worth. Not much is known about the woman. She is described as a white woman between the ages of 25 and 40. She had been strangled to death. She has never been identified. At the time, many people believed that one person was responsible for the 12 murders which happened between February 1977 and February 1986. 11 of the victims were women. The only man in the series was David Larson, who was Regina Grover's boyfriend, and she was murdered on the same night as him. Besides Larson and Sarah Ann Kashka, all the victims were strangled to death. Sarah is also notable because in the series of unsolved murders, she is the only minor. All the female victims were young and considered attractive. 2 of the women, Catherine Davis and Angela Ewart, were models, and Cindy Heller competed in beauty pageants. One thing that is notable is that 2 of the victims, Marilyn Hartman and Catherine Jackson, were English teachers at middle schools. They did not teach at the same school. They were both strangled to death in their homes, 6 weeks apart from each other. Besides David Larson, they were the only ones murdered in their homes. The bodies of the other women were dumped, usually in fields. At the time of this recording, it's unknown if one person is responsible for all 12 murders. It's also unknown if Glenn McCurley is the killer. If he did kill anyone else, he took that secret to the grave with him. If it is discovered that he is connected to other murders, we'll be sure to bring you another update. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. There's a link on the screen now, and there's a link in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.